Presidential debates are a staple of the election cycle, but in recent years, the drama of deciding who gets to host a debate and when can often be more exciting than the event itself. In a world where news is instant and everyone is connected, do they have the same impact and influence on elections as they once did? In this episode, I want to know, who cares about presidential debates? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, I'm joined by our resident election expert, Dr. Emma Long, but by day she's Associate Professor of American History and Politics at the University of East Anglia. Welcome back, Emma.
Hi, Liam. I sort of feel like I should apologise to regular listeners to the podcast. They've heard a lot from me recently, so anyone out there who's thinking, oh God, it's her again, deep apologies. I promise I'll stop talking eventually.
Yeah, I mean, it's the nature of the beast, right? We are midst election cycle, and we're getting a bit politics heavy, but I can promise any listeners that after November we're gonna lighten the load a little bit and do some other stuff, I promise. But in the meantime, we have Emma to help us understand what the heck is going on.
Well, I try.
And this week, to do that, we're going to take a closer look at presidential debates. Now, we were just talking before the recording that we've had this episode kind of in the pipeline for months, and I think the discussion today is going to take on a much different form than it would have done a couple of months ago. So let's just start before we get into maybe some more recent context. I'm just wondering if you can provide a bit of broad history on presidential debates.
Yeah, okay. So just out of interest, if I was going to ask you, when do you think the first presidential debate was?
Well, I'm a bit of a film and TV nerd, so I'm going to say it probably lines up roughly with sort of the boom in radio and maybe the birth of TV. So I'm going to say sort of 50s.
Yeah, you're pretty close. I mean, I think the one that most people think of when they think of the history of presidential debates are the Kennedy Nixon debates in 1960, right? The first kind of, Kennedy's sort of seen as like the first TV president about the way he used television, not just in the debates, but otherwise. And, the common sort of line on these is the idea that, viewers who watched TV thought that Kennedy won the debate, viewers who listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon won it, and the impact of visuals. Now, there are a lot of people who've written and said it's a bit simplistic to say that, and maybe it's not that, but that what the debates did was sort of legitimize Kennedy by giving him a platform. This relatively unknown senator from Massachusetts against sort of the very well-known Nixon, who'd been vice president under Eisenhower and so on. But this is where this gets complicated, because you'd think when was the first presidential debate would be a really straightforward question, right? But it sort of depends on how you define the presidential debate. So Kennedy-Nixon's kind of the first one that I think we would recognize, where you've got the two main candidates facing off against each other live, or at least it was live on TV. They didn't have a studio audience. There were 4 debates between the two of them, including one where they weren't in the same studio. So it's like the earliest version of a Zoom era debate, in that Kennedy was in New York and Nixon was in California, and which I just think is incredible when you think about the technology from 1960. Okay, so 1960, this happens. It seemed to be quite a big deal. When do you think the next one was?
Okay, so I'm naively going to make an assumption that I'm sure a lot of people would make, in that they just continued every election cycle after that. But I'm sure you're going to tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, I sort of signposted that one. 1976. Takes 16 years. before you get another presidential debate. LBJ in 64 refuses to hold them, but the next set of presidential debates that we know about is President Gerald Ford against the then relatively unknown Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, who was challenging him for the presidency in 1976. And it gets weirdly technical. So the reason that there's this big gap in the middle is to do with broadcast technology and the laws governing it. So the Communications Act in the US, which governed airtime and these kinds of things, basically said, was published in the 1930s, and basically said, if you're going to do something like this, you have to give every candidate for office time to speak, not just presidential candidates, but every possible candidate for elected office in every election. Which clearly was not possible and was not going to happen. And they couldn't find a way round it. So in 1960, they get kind of special dispensation from Congress to have the Kennedy-Nixon debate. But it takes until 1975 for Congress to basically find an exception to this rule, to this law for presidential debates and allow them to happen. And then they've happened every year since 1976. So everybody thinks of Kennedy-Nixon, but actually it's almost like a one-off in the midst of this, and then they don't become regular until the late 1970s. But if you think about presidential debates, not just as the candidates themselves, but say spokespeople on behalf of the candidates, interestingly enough, the very first presidential debate defined that way involves two women, which I think is probably kind of surprising. It happens in 1956, and on the program that is quite well known in the US, Face the Nation. So it wasn't a specific debate; it happened on a regularly scheduled TV program, and you have Eleanor Roosevelt speaking on behalf of the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson. And you have Maine Senator Margaret Chase Smith speaking on behalf of Eisenhower. So if you define presidential debates as being sort of party representatives rather than necessarily the candidates, the very first presidential debate was 1956, and it was two women, which I think is really great.
I also think it's really interesting that you had a former First Lady kind of quite actively campaigning. I know Michelle Obama, you saw her at the DNC, very recently to this recording, and the Obamas are quite outspoken, but Michelle Obama doesn't actually go out there campaigning, does she? No.
And I mean, she's been very clear, both in interviews, but also in her book, Becoming. She writes very clearly, I don't like politics. I'm not interested in going into politics. I will go out and talk about issues that are important to me. And, she talks about speaking out for people that she knows and people she respects and so on. But she's not driven by politics in the same way. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very different character. She was very engaged with Franklin Roosevelt's, not just the campaign, but his administration. And of course, because he was paralyzed as a result of polio, and it was difficult for him to travel and so on. She went out and about and met people that he didn't or couldn't or wouldn't. And she sort of fed that back to the administration. So she's an really interesting character in her own right, but continued sort of political engagement long after FDR died. I mean, she was a key figure in the development of the UN, for example, after World War II. So maybe she's somebody that we can talk about in a future episode of the podcast. I think she probably deserves at least an episode of her own.
Oh, I would love to do an episode on Eleanor Roosevelt and on FDR as well. I think maybe there's a sort of double header there. I think they obviously the two are going to overlap quite a bit. But I'd like to know, because you've explained a little bit about some of the reasons around kind of the rules why it took so long for the second debate. But I'm keen to know how popular that first debate was and how kind of the audience figures have changed over time.
Funnily enough, the figures haven't changed massively over time. So it's estimated that about 70 million people watched the first Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960. And I mean, it's easy to throw the number out there, right? 70 million is a huge number. I mean, take any, like the biggest of TV shows, right, at any moment in time would probably give their right arm for 70 million people watching, sitting down and watching it. So we're talking big numbers.
And also, just for context, that's basically the size of the entire population of the UK, right?
Yeah. And probably bigger, of course, than the population size in 1960.
Of course,
so
yeah.
just to give you, just to sort of compare that. And actually, if you look at figures over the years that are sort of made publicly available, so there's something called the Commission on Presidential Debates that was formed in the late 1980s that for many years, up to this year actually, organised the presidential debates. And their website that I think we're going to link to in the show notes has publicly available data on the number of viewers or estimated viewers for the debates over history. They suggest that numbers haven't changed a huge amount over time. They sort of hover between the low 60 million figure and sort of upwards depending on debate. So the most watched, we were talking about this before we started recording, right? The most watched presidential debate in US history to the current point was the first Clinton-Trump debate in 2016. And that's about 84 million people. And my understanding is that 84 million doesn't include people who would say watching it was streaming online or, that's TV viewers, which
That's
is
mad.
huge. And I mean, okay, as a percentage of the population, that's probably slightly smaller than the Kennedy-Nixon one, but it's still, I mean, that's 84 million households, right? Not just individuals, but households sitting down to watch the presidential debates. And just as a comparison, I mean, there's no point, I could sit and read all the numbers off, but that will bore everybody to tears. But the first Biden-Trump debate in 2020 was the third most watched in US history, and that had 73 million people. The one that was so consequential for this election cycle, the one June 2024, again, between Biden and Trump, where Biden just sort of basically his whole campaign imploded. The estimates for that are about 51 million.
Right.
So actually, in terms of the number of people who were watching it live, at least, that was a little bit down. And I think that probably reflects things we've talked about on this podcast before, which is that there was just a general apathy about the election. Fewer people wanted to tune in to watch two old white men basically debate each other in the format that they had debated each other in 2020. As of course we know, it all went unexpectedly wrong for the Biden campaign. And obviously I suspect many more people have seen clips of it since.
Exactly. And I think it's that engagement, that follow-up engagement with the debate that is probably more indicative of how much impact that debate has had. And, when you mentioned that, two of the three most watched presidential debates of all time involved Trump, that suggests to me that actually the audiences that they're galvanizing to tune in live are people that are already pretty loyal to one candidate or another and are tuning in to cheer that candidate on. And I wonder how effective the debates are as a piece of live television to sway undecided.
Yeah, it's difficult to tell, isn't it? Because if you like, and there's an interesting thing. The second most watched debate in US history was 1980, which was the first one with Reagan. I find it interesting that those three top ones are with presidential candidates who already had sort of a media presence. Reagan, of course, in films, though he'd had a political career since then. And Trump, obviously, we've talked about his background with The Apprentice and sort of his sort of people were familiar with him just from being around in
Yeah.
culture. It's hard to tell. I mean, the Pew Research Center, which is one of the great go-tos for sort of for public opinion polls. It's a non-partisan organization that does polls internationally on a whole range of issues. But the last time they asked about presidential debates and who was watching them and whether the people watching them thought that they were useful in sort of thinking about the candidates and deciding who to vote for. The last time they asked it, as far as I could see, was 2016, so that first Trump campaign, and about 63% of their poll suggested that people were interested and they found them useful in thinking either about the candidates or about the policies that they were following. And that number has been fairly steady in the years that previously that they had asked about this. Now, obviously, we know that American politics has become more partisan, it's become more divided, particularly when it comes to kind of presidential level and national level politics. On the ground, a lot of people kind of fall more into the purple zone than into the red or blue one, but national level politics has become increasingly divided, and particularly when you're talking about stuff with this kind of level of exposure. So whether that might have changed since 2016, it's difficult to tell whether people are watching to see their particular candidate and sort of to cheer them on and to see that their candidate sort of deliver the knockout blow, rather than tuning in to hear about policies. It may be that we don't have the evidence either way to suggest, but I mean, that wouldn't be new. If you ask people about like the most famous moments in the history of presidential debates, it's almost always gaffes that candidates, usually losing ones actually, that have made at various points. So this idea of tuning in either to see somebody deliver the knockout blow or alternatively to see whether they're going to fall apart, that in and of itself isn't new. What's new at the moment is, of course, the partisan context in which it's taking place.
And I think, you know, what can be so devastating for candidates now, particularly when they make a gaffe in a debate, is just how quickly that can spread and how much that can sort of come to define their campaign. Because, you know, with social media now, if you made a gaffe back in the 70s, okay, news wires might pick it up and play a little clip on the national news or whatever. Nowadays, within minutes, that is clipped, it's on social media, it's going viral, and many more millions of people that would never have bothered to watch the debate are now very aware that you made a mistake in that debate.
Instant memes, right? You know, and probably your worst moment, or sometimes the good ones. I mean, one of the interesting things about the 2020 campaign, the primary campaign, one of the things that raised Kamala Harris's profile was when she challenged Biden on busing. And that was sort of a similar thing, right? That got clipped and replayed and people showing that. So it can be good stuff, but I think the nature of our society and politics as it is at the moment is that we have a tendency to go, oh my God, look what they did. That's terrible. Let's share it.
Yeah, and actually, you know, with that in mind, I wonder how, you know, networks have dealt with the sort of the changing expectations that people have on debates now, and how that sort of impacted the way and the sort of the look and feel and the execution of presidential debates. You know, our TV networks having to think a little bit more about trying to get those sound bites, trying to and those elements that kind of bring people into the debate, maybe not live, but at least encouraging them to engage afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, actually, the networks haven't had control over this until this year, actually. So mentioned before, the Commission on Presidential Debates So that was formed in 1987 by an agreement between the Republican and the Democratic parties that there would be this kind of sort of non-partisan, non-profit organization that would be responsible for organizing the debates. And they usually have a moderator. And actually, if you look at the history of the moderators, they cover all of the major networks in the US. So CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, and actually PBS, which people here may not quite know so much about, is the public broadcasting system, which is the closest thing the US has to the BBC, although it's not exactly the same. So that those have always been shared round. And particularly since the advent of Fox News, when there have been enough presidential debates, there's always been that sense that, there's one conservative moderator and sort of the others along the way. But the point of the commission was set up so that the networks didn't have control over it, and the format was decided between the campaigns and the parties, and it's varied over time. Famously, for example, in 1992, one of the debates had like a more kind of town hall type feel. So they didn't have the podiums, but they had a live audience, and the candidates could walk around and sort of as if they were sort of chatting to people individually, and that's widely considered to have favoured sort of Clinton in '92 and this kind of style that he had of trying to connect with people. Obviously, you've got the famous moment from the 2016 campaign where Trump sort of loomed up behind Hillary Clinton as if like trying to intimidate her. That also went viral in terms of those. The numbers have varied year on year. Whether they have what kind of audience they have. In fact, if you look at them, a lot of them have been held on university campuses, which I think is kind of interesting. So it's a changeable feast, and it's determined, or has been at least determined, by the commission and the campaigns and the candidates, and who favours what and how many, and set the rules. This year was slightly different. So the Republican National Committee pulled out of the commission in 2022, and it sort of cited a whole range of things, but said that the moderators were biased, and also actually that the debates were too late. Normally they happen sort of September, October. Of course, the Biden one that we've been talking about was June, which is one, I think, about the earliest they've ever happened. And part of the reason for that was that a lot of states have early voting. So election day this year is November 5th, but a lot of states opened their polls up to 30 days before that. And obviously, if you've got postal votes, then you're voting early as well. So there's been an argument in recent years that actually some of those later presidential debates have been happening after people have already voted. So one of the reasons for having the June one this year was that it would reach people before early voting started.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just all of those cogs that are whirring in the backgrounds, sort of making those seemingly innocuous decisions about the format and the structure and the date of these debates, because it is all quite calculated from the campaign teams. And I don't know if anyone's ever watched the Newsroom, which is the Aaron Sorkin show from the early 2010s.
Love it, absolutely love it.
It's a great show, and if you haven't, go and watch it. And it sort of takes place during the 2012 election, so there's this very dramatized sort of arc in one of the seasons where the news network is trying to win a debate, but there's this sort of real compromise and negotiation happening between the news networks and the parties, to come to this sort of agreement on the rules and the format and the structure and all of these elements, so that everyone's happy. And it just really got me thinking about the debates as a campaign tool. They're not really these independent platforms, are they, to grill candidates?
No, they're stage managed. And candidates are grilled to within an inch of their lives on these, and particularly those ones that we've seen more recently, where it's been you have a certain number of minutes to reply, to comment, and then they have a certain number of minutes to reply and respond and those kinds of things. Of course, they're stage managed, absolutely, because even if they don't have the questions in advance, you kind of have an idea of what sort of topics are going to come up. To reference another Aaron Sorkin series, The West Wing, which came before the newsroom, they have several episodes throughout the series, the 7-year series, where they've got their candidates being prepped for the debates and how that plays out in a kind of dramatized way. But yeah, these are campaign events that are rigorously prepared for. I mean, as we're recording this, I mean, by the time the show goes out, they may have resolved it, but just as we're recording this, the current battle that seems to be going on is about the Trump-Harris debate and whether the candidates' microphones are going to be on or off when the other person is speaking. So the agreement with the Biden camp and what happened in the first debate was that microphones would be off when people weren't speaking, and this seems to have been a response to, I think it was 2020, another viral moment from the 2020 campaign where Trump is constantly interrupting Biden, and Biden quite famously says, "Will you just shut up, man?" He's fed up. He's getting fed up with being interrupted. So the agreements that they had this time was that microphones would be off to stop that. And the Harris campaign has tried to make a bid to have microphones on permanently. And, there's speculation about this, but as a general rule, it's thought that, again, this is about the campaigns, that the Republicans want the microphones off because it stops, it forces Trump to focus, and, he has that time that is allocated to him. And if he says something outside of that, the audience isn't going to hear it. So it makes him look more focused and on point. The idea that the Harris campaign want that on because they think that what it will show is him with outbursts and rambling on and all the rest of it, and they think that's going to help their campaign. So yeah, it's just a little example of exactly what you're talking about in the current circumstances, where the campaigns are trying to work out what format is going to most benefit their particular candidate.
Do you think they're almost sort of cutting their nose to spite their face, because when it's so tightly controlled, it can almost become boring?
Potentially. And if people want effectively car crash TV, right, there's that on the sort of edge of your seat, what's gonna happen. But I suppose it depends how you think about them, right? It's sort of, are these debates intended, regardless of what they end up being, are they intended to be spectacles, right? Where you watch the two candidates slug it out in whatever format they want? Or are they intended to kind of be some kind of public service in which people get to understand not just who the candidates are, but what they stand for? I think historically, at least, some of the reasoning for this was that there's a public service element here, right? That yes, it's an opportunity for the candidates and for the parties to get their platforms out there and say what they, where they stand on policy and all this bit. But there's that informative element, and I think probably where the balance has been, we all, of course, they've sort of emerged it more into spectacle. They probably always were, right? If it's televised and you've got an audience and you play up to the cameras, and especially in this era of sound bites and all the rest of it, of course that's part of it. But I think the format of them has always been about trying to manage that, and also provide some element where you don't just allow them to go off on whatever tangent they want, that actually it's meant to be informative to the public. So I think there's been a tension between those two things. And have they always got it right? Probably not, but lots of people are still watching, right? Regardless of why they're watching. And even if they do come for the spectacle, they're probably going to hear some stuff about policy as well.
Yeah, and I think lots of people are watching, not just in the US, but all over the world. I mean, we're two Brits sat here in the UK talking about US presidential debates, and we're not alone there. A lot of people care, and it makes me wonder if now that we're in an age where people want stuff on demand, and people aren't necessarily going to watch live, particularly if you're in a different time zone. There's surely argument there to think about people coming along like Netflix, who are now doing more live content, and Amazon Prime and all these other streaming services. Is it only a matter of time before one of them pick up these debates, and how is that going to change the look and feel of it versus a news network running it?
Yeah, it's hard to know, because the whole point of these, it's in a bit of flux at the moment. So in the years when the Commission for Presidential Debates covered it, the whole point was that this was, like I said, almost like public service broadcasting. This was not for profit. This was public service, and they made the feed of this available to any network that wanted to show it. So it's not about competing. It's not like, oh, ABC's got it this time and Fox News will have the other one. It could show on all of those channels at the same time, and historically has at various points. So it's hard to know. I mean, I can see the appeal of something like Netflix or Amazon Prime or other Disney Plus, or start running out of streaming services to mention here. Feel like the BBC, right? Other services are available. But I suspect there might be resistance to it, simply because of that idea about, is this about money shaping politics? Is it suddenly we've got companies for profit who are doing this, rather than companies that are doing it from a public broadcasting situation? And of course, most of them are streamed live anyway. So if you're thinking about an international audience, to the extent that the international audience actually matters, and I have some doubts about how much they're really thinking about the international audience, those things are available anyway via live stream these days. So you wouldn't necessarily need something like one of the streaming platforms to make it available. So I don't know. I mean, if you think about them as entertainment, you can see that, but I genuinely think there'd be sort of resistance to doing that.
And let's look at the June 2024 debate between Trump and Biden. I feel like we need to for a bit in this episode, because it hadn't happened when we were first planning to record this, and the answer that I would have had to this question on the podcast, who cares about presidential debates, would have been, well, not many people outside of a campaign team. Or that changed this year, didn't it? And so I'm keen to understand what lessons were learned from the Biden-Trump debate, because the wheels came off and it ended Biden's campaign, right?
Yeah. Despite his best attempts not to. And I mean, there had been concerns before, right? And I remember the discussion, what would Biden need to do in the debate? It was like, just not mess up, which is hardly a high bar, right, to ask someone to achieve. And in the end, that didn't happen. Yeah. I don't know. I think there was something quite specific about this particular election, right? About, we've talked before, we'll probably talk again, people were not enthusiastic. Even the partisans, right, were really not that enthusiastic about a Trump-Biden rematch. And there was just a lot of apathy about the election. And I mean, actually, if you look at the viewing figures for that debate, before anybody knew what was going to happen, right, they were the lowest they've been since, I think, probably since presidential debates started, right? So, the answer to your question, who cares? I mean, 51-ish million people is still a lot of people watching the debate, but it's significantly lower than in previous years, which does sort of suggest that people weren't that interested. Of course, what happened is that, things went wrong, and it showed up the weaknesses in Biden. And I think obviously more people have seen it since. And it's not the watching it live, it's the kind of the consequences of that. Lessons to be learned, that's hard to say. We've got, two more debates coming up, or at least two that have been agreed. One between Trump and Harris, and one between Walz and JD Vance.
I'm
The
looking
vice
forward to that one, by the
presidential
way. I'm
debate.
looking forward to
I
that one a
think,
lot.
yeah, I mean, that just two completely different characters.
Yeah.
Right. I just think that that has the makings of a really interesting one. And actually, interestingly, 2008, when Obama was running the first time, it's the one year that I could find where the vice presidential debate got higher viewing figures than the presidential candidates. I do wonder if the Walz-Vance one might be the same. The same here.
Yeah.
I guess we'll see. But I think we're only going to see the kind of the idea of lessons learned, or ways in which it shapes them, by seeing what happens next. And we haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
And also in terms of format, like I said, we're in slightly uncharted territory at the moment, because both parties have now pulled out from the commission on presidential elections. These ones have been organized directly with networks. And I don't think we yet know what impact that might have on how these are run and organized in the future. So there are a few things to watch out for, I think, going forward.
I think maybe then I should reword the question to this episode from who cares about presidential debates to why should candidates care about presidential debates? Because it feels like if you win a debate, or if you have this sort of really great soundbitey moment, people like it, but it doesn't necessarily transform your fortunes. If you have a really bad debate, actually, as we've seen it with Biden, it can end your campaign. So it just feels like the benefits do not outweigh the risks.
It's certainly a tightrope to be walked. And like I said, some of the famous moments are where candidates got it wrong, right? Which suggests those things are the things that live on in people's memories. But on the other hand, where they do seem to have benefited candidates, and actually this applies a little bit this year given everything that's happened, is to relatively unknown presidential candidates who are running for office. So Kennedy in 1960, Carter in 76, even to some extent Clinton in 92. These were people who, I mean, Kennedy I guess all of them really known in a kind of regional area within a small grouping, but didn't necessarily have a national platform. And what the debates did, in a way even campaigns couldn't necessarily, was give them a platform to get themselves known, sometimes as people, sometimes in terms of the policies. And I think that applies to Harris too. I mean, one of the things that people have been talking about is the fact that despite the fact that she's been vice president for 4 years, she's relatively unknown to most Americans. And we're seeing the pressure at the moment. Why hasn't she sat down for a TV interview at the moment? Why is she now saying that she'll sit down for one, but she's bringing a vice presidential candidate along? Is this because she doesn't want to do it by herself, or she can't do it by herself? You have to take all of that with a pinch of salt. This is all driven to some extent by the partisan side of things. But in the same way that the conventions can provide a platform for people, the debates can do that too, especially for candidates who are less well known. And the one thing that we've not talked about so much is sort of the getting to the presidential debate. So increasingly there are primary debates that are televised now. Again, not entirely new. There are some examples of that happening on small scale, particularly in battleground states in the past. But those are becoming nationally televised as well. So you're getting more and more opportunities to do that. But yeah, I mean, I still think that there is a risk to candidates, as we saw with Biden this year. And speaking as somebody who finds live public speaking quite terrifying, Because you never quite know, are you going to have a blank moment? Are you going to suddenly forget all the dates or the information that you had? And, what if you can't find the right words, or, what if somebody asks you something you weren't prepared for? Particularly ramp that up to a massive scale when you're talking about national and international policy. And there are real risks there. But at the same time, that ability to respond and to deal with that, is something that Americans expect of their leaders. And if you're not going to show that in something that is as structured as a presidential debate, then that's going to be significant for people to want to know as well.
Yeah, it's a great point to end on, and when you look at the rhetoric, in response to the Biden-Trump debate, that was part of it. It was a demonstration of just, it was kind of an affirmation of all the doubts that people had in his mental state, I guess, and his ability to lead at that level for another 4 years.
It's weirdly unfortunate as well, because then you see the speech that he gave at the DNC, that very forceful speech, and the meetings that he had at various times with international leaders, all of whom have no reason to come out and say, oh yes, yeah, he was on top of it and all the rest of it. So I think I'm pretty sure I've said before on one of these, Biden is clearly somebody who has good days and bad days, right? At this point. And I think about my parents in particular circumstances, and maybe they have good days and bad days too. The consequences are different, clearly. But at the same time, I think the debate in many ways showed Biden sort of at his worst. And on a different day, maybe wouldn't have been quite the same outcome, but it did, and we've seen the fallout of it.
Yeah, and by the time this episode goes out, I think it would be just before the next debate. By the time we talk about this again, who knows? Maybe after September 10th, the tickets are going to change again. Who knows?
Crikey. I don't think the system could cope with that.
Yeah, unlikely. But hey, who'd have thought that the first one would have had the sort of consequences it did? And I think it shows that there is still a lot of weight to the presidential debates, and clearly a lot of people still do care about it when we consider the sort of very recent impacts that it's had. But thank you, Emma, for joining me on this episode to sort of give a bit more of the sort of history behind that. Really interesting to understand more about how the debates started and how they evolved into what we know they are today. So thank you so much, Emma, and to anyone listening. If you do want to find out a little bit more about presidential debates, we can put some links in the show notes for you to do just that. And Emma, if anyone wants to connect with you, where can they do that?
Oh, as regular listeners will know, I'm not on social media. So if you search for my name at UEA, you'll find my email address. It's probably the best way to get in touch. And thank you for inviting me on. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, it's always great, Emma. And you can find me on X as well. This is the Hef, and on LinkedIn. And of course, you can find the show on Patreon. We are on there. So if you do want to support the show, we're going to record some bonus content straight after this that you'll find only on Patreon. So do check us out on there. And if you're listening to this podcast, which obviously you are, give us a rating and a review. It only takes a few seconds, and it will really help us and help other people find the show as well. Thank you very much, and goodbye.